Hello, boys, gals, and non binary pals. Yes, I stole that greeting from Justin Alexander. I think it's an awesome greeting. Today we have Guy Sclanders from How to Be a Great Game Master, and we are talking about introducing and handling different cultures in our tabletop role playing games. In the recent years, millions of new people have joined this hobby, and I feel like not all of them see their cultures represented in the hobby the way other folks from different parts of the world do. Don't get me wrong, I'm also well aware that this is a very charged topic, which means a lot of perfectly well intentioned folks get apprehensive. Hopefully, this discussion will help you all get over that fear, understand things a little bit more, and delve into essentially a limitless possibility of exploration. And just looking at the real world, there's no end of topics, and there's no end of cultures, and there's no end of adventures that you can run at your table. So, without further ado, I give you Guy Sclanders.
All right.
The first question I wanted to ask, do you think that, because we have had campaign settings, right? Like we have had them during the AD&D ages from TSRs and things, but is campaign settings the right way to approach inclusion of different cultures? Like, is that the first step to mining stories and myths from different cultures and including them into our games, whatever system? I don't care about the system.
Good. I'm glad that you said, because the system is not particularly important at this sort of level that you're talking about. And I think, from my perspective, it's a double answer. So, my campaign world or worlds that I build, I am someone who I've luckily traveled the world and have been able to be exposed to different cultures. And just growing up in South Africa, there were so many different cultures that were on top of each other that I kind of took it as a given that that's how the rest of the world worked, was that, well, you just knew what 9 different cultures were like because that's what everyone had, right? Or 10 or 12 or whatever.
Yeah.
So when I build my worlds, I just draw from all of those different cultures. But I think it's important to realize that when you are drawing from a culture, it's about trying to understand how it was or how it is that the people that live in that culture believe that to be the right way to do things. Because once you understand why they believe that to be the system that works, it becomes a lot easier for you to do it. So if you're building a world and you say, okay, great, we want to have, I don't know, let's use ancient Egypt. Everybody loves to go to ancient Egypt and run around with Anubis and Ptah and Khnum and all of those wonderful gods, right?
Absolutely.
Possibly because they have been the ones that I would say arguably are the ones that are most used in filmmaking and that sort of thing. You kind of think Indiana Jones, right? It's almost
Right.
invariably always ancient Egypt and that. So,
Yeah.
if you are just going to say, right, I've got some pyramids, there's lots of sand, I've got some weird gods, and there's hieroglyphics everywhere.
Mhm.
That's not creating the culture. That's just painting a picture, and that's a good thing to do, but it isn't creating the culture. And so then you've got to dig deeper. So, for me as a GM, if I can understand the way the culture works, whatever my players are then doing, I just put it within the context of that culture and I go, yes, this is in alignment with the culture, or no, it's not. And it gives me a great place to then start improvising and figuring out what the culture would do based on what the PCs are. So yes, I think it's important to do it at your campaign or at your world setting level, but then also when you are running adventures and when you are looking to do things in a different way, or you're looking for inspiration, I feel that kind of almost throwing a dart onto a world map and saying, oh, what is a mythological story? What is a cultural idea? What is something that happens in that random place that I have selected? And doing some research on it and going, okay, well, yes, what are Cambodia's myths and legends? What are Cambodia's old gods? What are their, talk about an era from Cambodia. What was happening in Cambodia in 1312 AD or CE. Who knows, right? Well, you can go do some research, and then you're adding that. So that would be my answer. So it's kind of a double prong kind of thing, but it boils down to research and understanding. And of course, never, ever pulling things from a culture because you find them silly or stupid, or you're trying to mock them, or because that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand why you would do that. You should be pulling from them going, hey, this is a cool thing. Personally, I might not agree with it as a modern human being on planet Earth. But within a fantastical setting, well, actually, this makes more sense.
Absolutely. So I feel like it is important, like almost like the contextualization of the culture is through the people and how they believe and react to actions, behavior, rituals, etc. So focus on the So in terms of an RPG, would you say that would be a relatively easy way to implement that is like the villain or the antagonist, or however you want to put it, from that area of the world or that adventure, reflects those values and the mores and the folkways of that culture. Is that an easy way to put it for your first time out, or is it?
I wouldn't do it that way. I would do it in a slightly different way. Same idea. The villain, if you are trying to introduce this culture to your players, and firstly, I don't feel that you should ever try and use a hammer and just bang it into them saying, accept this thing. I think you should have them interact with NPCs, and the NPCs drop a little bit of information. Don't info dump. Don't kind of just give them buckets and buckets and buckets of stuff, unless the players are wanting to be part of that culture. And then, of course, you give them some info. But when it comes to the villain, I think what the villain should do, and this is for villains across board, when they are representing their culture, they should represent the very extreme worst parts of their culture. And it is by the fact that they are representing the worst parts of the culture that the rest of the culture kind of then get put into it makes it more interesting when the players go, oh, look, all of the people from, well, let's stick with ancient Egypt. All of the ancient Egyptian elves are evil because the villain is trying to sacrifice everybody to send them to Anubis to have their souls weighed for, I don't know, whatever reason. And then when they meet other elves from the ancient Egyptian empire, and those elves are like, no, that person is insane. They're crazy. We're not like that at all. We believe in working together as a community. And yes, we have a pharaoh who leads us, but the pharaoh. So what it does is it's about creating truths. And this is something that it's I don't want to say it's a new concept, but I'm working on my latest book at the moment. And I had this kind of revelation, well, not a revelation, more of a canonizing of this idea that when we are role playing, if you think back to the games that you remember the most, characters that you created that you remembered the most, oftentimes it's because they felt the most real. It was almost as if you were there rather than the character.
Like their memories are my memories almost.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that, I believe, comes from the fact that as a species, we remember things that are emotionally true, that resonate with us from an emotional perspective, but also from a truthful perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that the truth is the actual truth, but it's what we as people have experienced as being true. So the more things that you can build into your campaign world, into your world setting, and into your character that are grounded in truth, or that are validated by truthful things, the better. So what I mean by that in context of culture and using cultures and things is when you are presenting a culture, looking into the basic things of how does the culture greet one another, right? How do they say hello? And if you look at different cultures, the different ways that they say hello, you've got the very impersonal kind of English approach, which is good morning, hello, immediately followed by the how do you do, which is not an actual question. It's just part of the greeting. You've got namaste, which is a completely different thing altogether. That's about seeing you and you as a spiritual being. So every culture has got these differences. They're subtle, but they bring a truth to it. They make it more visceral, more real to you as the player. Whenever characters meet the tabaxi in my one world setting, that's based very much on the generic Indian subcontinent culture of the caste system. But my tabaxi will always greet with saying, I see you. And, because that's something that I'm drawing some inspiration from. But by repeating it and by doing it, when anyone suddenly says, I see you, the players in my games go, oh, you're from Cathar. And you go, yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter whether they're a tabaxi or an orc or whatever. If they use that greeting,
I was going to say that.
Right?
In terms of D&D, like a culture can be multiracial. It doesn't have to be this, like all elves are like this.
100%. Absolutely agree with you. Yes. And it is something that I do personally have a bugbear with, is that this idea that each species has its culture and that's it. And you go, but why? What if humans moved into the orc territories and the orcish people are traditional fantasy orcs? The human would have those culture values. So
I mean, culture is so much defined by the location of where they live, right? By the ecology around them. It's not what, in terms of the real world, what color of the skin it is. Like,
exactly.
Or in terms
100%. And a lot of culture is derived from the environment, as you were saying. It's literally the location. You look at how Inuits survive on the tundra. Their culture, a lot of the things that they take for granted as, well, this is just what we do, is because they're surrounded by permafrost and ice, as opposed to the culture from Central Congo, which, you go, but they're nomadic too. They have some commonalities, but there's a very different approach, right? There's very different ideologies and the more you look into cultures, especially the non-mainstream cultures, the more you find this super rich field to draw from and to say, hey, this is something that people did because they had to do it. And then it became a thing. It just became part of their culture. And so I've always hated the idea of Dungeons and Dragons using the alignment system for the species. And they go, oh, all right, all goblins are, chaotic evil. All of these are this particular. And you go, but alignment really, that's a perspective thing. From that culture's perspective, they wouldn't be seen as chaotic evil. They'd be seen as lawful good if they are doing what they're supposed, So I love looking at this stuff and adding it in. And then when your players walk into a place, suddenly it's alive with all of these little truths, which at the beginning, they don't see them as being truthful. They just see them as the GM is giving us fluff. But when you reinforce it and you stick to it and you keep to it, well, then suddenly it becomes a truth and becomes much more vivid memory for the players. And for you as the GM, I find this super easy because once you've internalized that culture, you could wander around the streets of any one of the nations from my campaign world. I wouldn't have a problem creating 1 million NPCs from that particular culture who will have stuff that is, it's all informed by the culture. So doing improv is easy because you go, well, what's the culture? Yeah. What's a few other bits and bobs, and off you go. I love culture.
No, the way you put the question about like things that stick to our memory is very true, because I very vividly remember what hooked me onto your channel this was like years ago, you made the video about traveling, and where you said, when you were sharing one of your experiences where you and your friend were camping on a mountain and you saw a sunrise, and that after a terrible night of like rain or something, and that memory is what stuck with you. And that kind of resonated with me, is like, that memory is like the memory that you have in the parking lot after the game is the story of the game, right? Like, so that's what you have to give them. Yeah. So the following follow-up question to that, and this is because, I've lived in the US for many, many years. Most of my friends were Americans, and especially someone who is conscious of things like cultural appropriation and how it is, if done not very seriously, can be very offensive. But that being said, it's still a game. A game master can only put in so much time and preparation. So, but I often see that people who are culturally sensitive like this feel intimidated, be like, I don't want to try to do a Chinese culture thing because what if I don't understand it fully and then I end up being offensive? So, and of course, a normal person cannot always hire a sensitivity reader for their things. So like, how would you approach / encourage them, and what are the pitfalls to be aware of? Like, how would one approach that in such a situation?
I think there's two answers here. Again, sorry. The one answer is for your personal game, and another answer is for a commercial product. And I think they're quite different. So, literally, my game that I run, and it comes out on Fridays. I have a gentleman who is from Ireland, and I said to him, "Look, buddy, my gnomes, they're Irish, and I put on a terrible bad Irish accent because that's what my gnomes sound like. And if you don't like it, you should tell me now." And he looked at me and he said, "Look, I'll be honest with you," because of course he's got an Irish accent. He said, "You sound terrible. You sound as if you are my grandmother, because nobody speaks with an accent like that anymore." And I was like, "You literally just spoken back to me in the exact same accent that I've just given you." Anyway, that's so. I think it is about making sure that the people at your table are comfortable and that they are happy and understand, again, as I said before, that you are cherishing and celebrating these differences. And you are not going, okay, all of my villains are French because of the French culture that I am choosing. Let's say we are choosing pre-revolution culture. So there's a huge discrepancy in the financial situation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all my villains are French. That's when it starts, in my opinion, to tread on the, well, hang on, what are you actually saying? At the same time, when you are doing these things, if you understand the culture and you are looking at it and you are saying, hey, I am not making, I don't know, let's pick a culture that we haven't looked at. Okay, I am not going to make, or I am going to make my orcs using the Zulu culture from Southern Africa. The Zulu culture was, at one stage, an incredibly militaristic culture where violence and sacking of other chiefdoms was the thing. We know this to be true, but they were also a culture who had a huge musical and lyrical thing as well. So bringing in that, where you go, here are a people who will collectively sing when they are sad, when they are happy, when they are celebrating, when they are mourning, when they are just working, bring that in, bring in the bloodthirsty side of it as well, if that's part of the culture that you want to show. But I think as long as you're not just cherry picking the negative things, you're bringing the whole thing through. I think that makes a big difference. Now, when it comes to commercial work, that's where it becomes a lot more difficult. And I feel that if you are going to do a setting where you are using these different cultures and things, even if you have the best intentions in the world, it will make huge sense for you to jump onto a social media and say, hey, I've written this thing about ancient Egypt. Are there any ancient Egyptians still alive? Because the current people living in Egypt are not ancient Egyptians, but are there any people who worship the old gods that can read my material? And unfortunately, there is this space that we're in where you might even have someone who has gone stamp of approval as someone who is from this culture. I don't find it offensive. You are still going to get people who say, I find this offensive on behalf of someone somewhere.
Yeah.
And you go, well, unfortunately, this is a game, as you say, and it is what it is,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a little bit how I felt with the Radiant Citadel from Wizards of the Coast, because I was very excited about that. And when I got the book, I just flipped straight to the one about Indian culture. But then I was severely disappointed because I'm like, there is a lot, like the names, I can absolutely recognize them. They're like very,
right.
But then the adventure did not really serve any of that. I'm like, okay, but like, if I put this in front of my players, this just becomes some word salad of difficult names and hard to pronounce and doesn't really drive it. So like, that was one of the.
Absolutely. And again, I think that is from knowing how these sort of adventures and things are put together. I think a lot of that is from being overly cautious. So what happens is, instead of having something that embraces these kinds of spaces, you get this generic, and you go, but if I just change the names to Brian, Bob, and Margaret, this adventure would not change. So what the hell?
Exactly.
And unfortunately, I also feel like that is someone going, okay, we want to try and be inclusive, but we're not actually being inclusive.
Yes.
And you go, well, why did you do it then? Why bother in the first place? But don't get me started on D&D products, because a lot of their products, I'm like, what is this? Why is this? This doesn't make sense. But yes, from a cultural perspective, the one point that you raised there is the names for the namesake, right? So if you look at, let's say, some Indian names,
just because before you go, mea culpa, I have done that. Like in my personal game, I have tried to run it, and it just became difficult names to pronounce. It could have been Brian, Bob, and Margaret, and it would make no difference. Right.
Exactly. But when you look at names, you go, okay, well, some Indian names, they're quite long, right?
Mm-hmm. Like, absolutely. Yeah.
Multiple different syllables put together. But then again, look at the San Bushmen from, again, Southern Africa. They have clicks in their names, which most people can't do. And so when you are creating this, you're going, I want to include the culture, but I don't want to alienate my players to such a point that they're like, oh my God, we are never going to that map area again because I couldn't say anything. Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it is definitely, it's a thing. Personally, I will do everything in my power to learn how to pronounce the names correctly. But I was fortunate that I grew up in this multicultural environment. People who don't have that exposure kind of go, I can't do it. I don't have the ear training. I don't have the vocal training. And it becomes a barrier rather than bringing you into the cultural space and saying, hey, let's share, let's be inclusive, let's do all of this kind of stuff. It's putting up a gate going, if you cannot pronounce a 15-letter long name, or you use the wrong click in the wrong place, you can't,
Yeah,
so
that's, Then it becomes a bit like gatekeeping. This happens like I grew up in India, and we have like so many different types of names, right? Like, and I grew up with all of them. But actually, I wanted to bring this in as the next point. Is like I was recently running Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, which is a very wuxia RPG, and when I was reading the adventure, it had a lot of authentic Chinese names. And I'm like, wait, is this the same name that I read the last time? I'm like, wow, if this can happen to me, and I grew up steeped in so many different, authentically different cultures, and it's still, so it's not a bad thing that it happens to someone who is grown up in a very monocultural environment. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's not.
I agree. I do think that this is it's one of the rules of script writing when you're writing something for film or for television or for a book, is you try and avoid having names that are similar to avoid this confusion, regardless of culture or anything along those lines. So if you have Xi Ping as one character, you shouldn't then have another Xi Ming. And you're like, but those are two authentic names. Absolutely, sure. Yes. But you also, at the same time, would avoid something like having a Buck and a Chuck if you're going with American kind of names, right? Yes. Because there is that opportunity for the participant to get confused. So there's a lot of subtleties to really making those truths come through, making the story stick in the mind of your player, and so I mean, but it's fun. That's part of why we're jamming, right? Is navigating all of these interesting things.
Absolutely.
Oh, what do I need to do? So.
Yeah, like it can be hard, but not to lose sight that we're still doing this for fun. Be sensitive, but there's also limited. At least for personal games, there are limitations to how far. Okay, so the next thing that leads into that, and this is something that I have struggled a little bit in my personal life, in the sense that whether we like it or not, D&D is the big dog in this space, right? And it is one of those that tries to do everything, but I don't think it really does everything very well. So, like, is there a one game that can actually capture all of this, or do we need separate games? Like, for instance, I said Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, which Seth Skorkowski turned me on to, but that you cannot put random fantasy elves in that game. It's not going to work. That is a game that does this, and that's what it does. So is that an approach, or is there even, like, is it even possible to have like a big tent RPG that can potentially capture all?
Oh, I mean, that's so from a mechanical perspective, right? Because that really is what it boils down to. There's mechanics, which RPGs all have to have in one shape, form, or another. And then there's the setting. And so when I am looking at role-playing games, I'm going, okay, sure, this is the predefined space. So Dungeons and Dragons has really codified their space. And this was something that I had to learn. The more I did professional GMing, the more I realized, in my mind, Dungeons and Dragons was not predefined setting. It was just this generic space that I could color however I like. But 5th edition specifically has really kind of gone, no, this is Faerun, and these are the rules, and these are the species, and these are the cultures that they use, which are all kind of very generic because they've been cautious, I think. And so you go, oh, but what if I put my own setting on? A lot of players go, but that's not the D&D setting. And you go, okay, all right. It's the same as if I was running a Star Trek game. I'm like, okay, so I'm completely erasing everything from the Star Trek canon and I'm replacing all the aliens with my own. The question you ask is, well, then why are you using a Star Trek role-playing game? Or why are you using Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game? And there are systems out there. I haven't played them, but people have told me, oh, go look. Things like GURPS, which the whole idea was that it was a generic system so that you could run anything in set anywhere. And so when you look at the mechanics, you go, well, the mechanics really need to support the cultures. Because if they don't support the cultures, then why are the mechanics, or why are the cultures there in the first place? And you go, well, that's for story, and that's for narrative, and that's for flavor. Okay, great. But if it doesn't mean anything mechanically, then there's a lot of players who are just going to go, well, I don't care. I don't want to put in the effort of going to go and do some research to figure out how the Romans used to shake hands. I don't care.
Yeah, because that puts the onus and the cognitive load on the players all of a sudden, and the game gives you no help.
Absolutely. Although that would be the way that you would then not have this disconnect between the mechanics and the cultures, and you could then play anything with any kind of setting and cultural information being put in place. So then you go, okay, cool. Well, if I want to make a role-playing setting that is going to fit within the mechanics, do I then need to come and generate cultural advantages and disadvantages for 192 different cultures? I can tell you now, it's a great challenge, but your book would be huge, weigh 25 pounds, and your shipping fees would be so expensive no one could ever buy your book. And also, that would be so overwhelming for players to go, wait, there are 109, however many we have. I mean, we have more than 190 cultures on this planet.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Maybe there's a thing. I mean, whenever I get asked these kind of questions, and I'm like, well, yeah, Savage Worlds does this, but it doesn't do that, and you can do it this way. Immediately, my brain starts trying to figure out, well, just because it sounds difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Yes.
So how would you do it? Watch this space.
Okay, I will. That's a bit of a teaser. But so with that in knowledge, like for instance, like just if we try to actually, it's unsolvable right now in this space, but like if we just try to codify one way or the other, do you think and because my opinion is, I think a skill-based game is more well equipped to handle this than a class-based, because the class-based, I think, inherently alienates certain things. Like the fighter art for 5th edition is amazing, but that fighter has very little to do with the art. The mechanics has very little to do with the art. But then we have the monk, which is this one class does not fit any of these other classes that you have put in. And the mechanics shows everybody thinks that the monks are not well balanced with the rest, right? So do you have any opinions on that? Like, do you think one way could be better?
I 100% agree with you. Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, I believe, had the closest approach to solving the issue that you're talking about. They had a system called kits. And so you would have your basic character and you would still choose a class. So you would say warrior, but within the warrior, they then had 15, 20 different kits that were very specific to different kind of cultures. So you could play a samurai, you could play a traditional knight, you could play a swashbuckling cavalier, you could play a chevalier, an actual knight who rides horses into battle. So there they were really trying to add in cultural context, in broad strokes, cultural context into the system. I am a advocate of the whole skills ideology. I think that's a really strong base. You look at Call of Cthulhu, where you've got 40 or 50 skills and the characters kind of improve them slowly as they go on rather than a class. There is definitely, that is much more representative. Is it the right way? Maybe. I mean, Modifius doesn't use skills at all. They don't use classes either. You combine attributes and abilities, or traits, and when you look at those three, you're going, okay, well, now it starts to become personal choice. Do you like the more freeform? Do you like the more rigid with just lots and lots and lots of skills? A challenge that a lot of players have with that is that then they don't really know what to do in terms of creating their characters. They kind of lack focus. Well, how do I make a warrior? Well, you'd have this skill and maybe that's, but where does it tell me that? And then you end up going, well, yeah, okay, fine. Here's the warrior class. These are the skills that you get. Stop asking to be spoon-fed this information. But skills for me is where it's at. I love a skills-based system.
I think I have also over the last 2 or 3 years, like, come to love skill-based systems over class-based systems. It's just the flexibility it gives. Right? Yeah. Okay. And like also on this, like there are some games that are the game itself is very tied to the setting, right? Like Blades in the Dark. This happened to me is like I kept wanting to run a heist in my 5th edition D&D game back then. I would go online and be like, hey, is there any nice heist adventure? And 50 different people will be like, why aren't you playing Blades in the Dark? I'm like, okay, fine, I will go check it out. And then I go to check it out and I'm like, this is incomprehensible. Like, I cannot just lift the system and put it in my game. Like, why are you sending me to this game? You know? But it's very good at what it does. Like, is that, it's kind of like ties back to the previous question, I guess. But like, do you think that there's value in games like that? Because on a commercial point of view, if you tie it to a setting, your audience is going to shrink.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So is that, yeah.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So if you tie it to a fantasy setting, your audience is going to be bigger than if you tied to any other of the settings. So steampunk or sci-fi or modern or whatever. By virtue of the fact that from what I've experienced, players understand the generic Western fantasy setting. They have preconceived ideas. Elves are like this, orcs are like this, dwarves are like this, gnomes are like that. And so for the average player, it's less work if it's a fantasy-based setting than if it's a sci-fi or anything else for that matter, right? So that's that part. But with regards to having mechanics for specific types of games, you go, okay, right. So Blades in the Dark for heists, Call of Cthulhu for insanity, weird, mind-bending kind of stuff. Dungeons and Dragons for epic fantasy, fighting monsters and defeating things. The Star Trek for Star Trek, right? I think all of that stuff comes down to the mindset and the expectations that the players bring with them. So if you are setting up a Dungeons and Dragons game and you are telling your players before they create their characters, this game is about heists and it's going to be about breaking in, stealing things, planting things, all that kind of stuff. You are setting them up to creating characters that are going to be good at doing that. Blades of the Dark, your players are automatically doing that without being told because that's the setting. Call of Cthulhu, your players are automatically creating characters that they know are going to go insane. So if you try and do a Call of Cthulhu-esque horror thing in a D&D game, it just ain't going to work. So when you look at it from that perspective, you realize, hang on, it's more about the session zero than anything else. Absolutely. If you are doing a one-shot and you want something that just works very differently, then yes, you go, okay, cool, let's do Blades in the Dark. But if you're doing Blades in the Dark and you suddenly go, you know what? I actually want to do a serious political thing now in the middle of this game. It's not going to work.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I tend to look for mechanics or for game systems that allow me to determine what the game type is going to be as I'm going, rather than something that says, oh, right, well, this is for running this kind of game, or this is for running that kind of game. I once was asked to run a game of The Dark Eye, which is a German publication, Das Schwarze Auge, which was based on like first edition D&D, but it was the German version. And it's a heavy rule book. It is a world setting that spans 30 real-time years of creation. Hey. An NPC that you met in 1987, and I now have to do the math, in 1984, so it's easier maths, an NPC that was in the book in 1984 is now, in the latest version, 30 years older. That's how specific that setting is, right?
Wow. Okay.
there is no way I am going to run a game of the Schwarze Auge in that setting, because I do not have a lifetime to quickly go brush up on that stuff.
Mhm.
So when I ran it, I put it in my own generic fantasy setting. Boy, oh boy, were the majority of the comments, oh, but that's not the right setting. You can't play that game in that setting. I was like, says who?
I just did.
I just did.
Also, I just did.
Fun. I had fun. What's there to complain about, right?
Yes.
So I do think that it is, those systems are fun to have. Those systems are cool if you're doing kind of one shots, or if you have a very specific group that wants to do that thing in perpetuity. But it's more about the mindset before the game starts than anything else.
All right. I think last question. I know you have to go. So I think this is because I always have a lot of sympathy and empathy for game masters, because I think they put in the most effort. How much of keeping in mind your players' cultures is important / should that even be a consideration? The reason I ask is, one of the very early games my game master was running for me and my friends, he had introduced some vampires, but they're like the modern vampire style. And he put in clues for everybody, and all of my other friends were Americans, and everybody understood that these are vampires, and I had no clue that they're vampires. The flip side of that is when he introduced a Rakshasa, nobody else understood that this is a Rakshasa except for me. So there is a risk in these times when we have all of these people that experience could have been like, oh, maybe this is the game for me. But is that something that the game master even has to consider, or to what level do they do?
In your personal game, I believe that you should, if you've got someone who's got a different culture, dive into them and ask them questions and go, hey, I know you are someone who like take you, for example. I would go, okay, where in India did you grow up? What are some of the traditions that came from India, from that particular area? Talk to me about what did your great grandparents do? Were they strongly in support of the old gods or the new gods? Are we talking Hanuman and Ganesha, or are we talking actually, no, we're in a very different perspective? Give me information. What types of food? What is this? What is it? Because that is stuff that I crave personally, because it just makes me a stronger person in terms of understanding culture. When you are doing commercial games, I think it becomes really important to try and understand that. I mean, I was running a game the other day where I had someone from Israel, I had two folks from Baghdad, and I had a gentleman from Germany, but he grew up in Eastern Germany when it was controlled by the Russian.
Yeah.
And I have all of these people sitting around my table, and I'm like, okay, guys, let's start talking about some culture. Let's start learning about each other's culture. Let's start learning about histories and things. All of them were like, we just don't want to talk politics. I was like, that's fine. I don't care about the politics of now. Talk to me about this, what happened here. Talk to, and it just made the table so much better. There were obviously times where there was cultural confusion, where something that, say, the American players took for granted that nobody else understood, or there were times that, the East German would say something and I'd go, oh, yeah, because I have had some German experience, and everybody else was like, huh? So embrace those differences. And then, I spend a lot of time with those poor players during lunch and dinner and stuff. I was like, so tell me more, feed me this information. I want to know. And I'll share with you all of my stuff too, but I want from, so that's my approach.
Okay. Absolutely. I think that's very good advice, because there are people especially players who are playing now, who in the real world might feel not feel a sense of belonging. And then you invite them into the game, and if they still feel a not sense of belonging, then they might check out for no reason apart from there was a misalignment of understanding. Yeah. So I think that's brilliant advice.
It goes beyond just culture. I think it goes to personal as well. I've seen so many people come to the table and do stuff, and you look at it and you go, I don't understand why you did that. Or when you're talking about things like sexuality and gender norms and personal things, I do a kind of a checklist before my players. If I'm playing with new players that I haven't met before, there's a checklist that I kind of run through, and I say, okay, hey, let's talk about things that you don't want to have in the game, things that you do want to have in the game. And that's, I prefer to do it in a one-on-one kind of situation, because then it's a safer kind of space. But I have had so many players use the role-playing space to kind of identify who they are, and not discover who they are, but kind of test the waters and kind of say, well, if I actually tell people that I do believe in the in let's say I'm a Wiccan, I practice witchcraft in the traditional sense, how are the people around the table going to react? You go, well, bring that in, use that information and represent it, but being in a safe kind of space. And I think people often dismiss role playing and they go, safe space, well, all that nonsense. I'm just here to have fun. And you're like, yes, you are. But you understand, we are pretending to be things we're not, and we're pretending to have relationships. There isn't a single human on this planet who can't not be part of that. Your character is you.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter how good a role player you are. At some point, your character is you. So I need to know you, and I need to be safe and comfortable around you. And I think the negativity or the negative connotations of being aware, trying to be inclusive of everybody, I think people kind of look at that and go, oh, I don't want to do that. That's making the game too serious. That's this, that's that. The next thing. I think those people are just lazy. And it's about them not wanting to actually do any work or effort in building friendships and building these amazing things that are potentially there. Or they're scared of doing it, right? I mean, so anyway.
Yeah. No, I think it's really good to talk about. That's kind of what prompted me to do so, because I have, especially in the online space, and I know online there's usually the vocal minority was the problem, is oftentimes I see in forums and discussions and such that someone who has a bit of a different idea, not even an identity, just a different idea, people around behave in an obnoxious manner so as to make them conform to their, I'm like, you just killed an avenue that we could have gone down and had fun. Because fun doesn't, you can have fun with all of this in there. It doesn't have to devolve into deep political debate. So thank you for saying that. And thank you, Guy, for being on the channel and giving us your insights. So if you are a game master who wants to include different cultures into your game or haven't thought about it, hopefully this podcast will help you alleviate some of the fears or maybe spark some inspiration for you to delve into different cultures for your game. Also, if you don't know, which would be surprising, who Guy is, he has a channel called How to Be a Great Game Master. I will put the links in the doobly-doo. Please go check out his channel and give him a like, subscribe, and all that jazz. Thank you, and that's all, folks.